We are back on the Orange and Brown Talk podcast. And so here we go. It's me, it's Doug, it's Ashley. We have just listened to the experts who cover each of the three teams and the three coaches that we're discussing here. And I just real generally am curious. Anything you want from any of those interviews, what stood out to you guys? Like, Doug, what stood out to you just kind of listening to those three interviews about these coaches?
I think it was probably Hoynesy basically admitting that no matter how good Terry-Francona is, the Guardians maybe just aren't built to do this. And that this is a conversation where we're taking people and organizations into account. And Terry-Francona in this discussion has more of a resume than Kevin Stefanski and jb-bickerstaff combined times 10. But can the franchise do it? And so when you think about Terry-Francona, we all know the realities of the Guardians right now. And it doesn't mean it's impossible for the Guardians, but Paul Hoynes is Guardians coverage. And if he's saying like, just going to be a tough slog, man, that affects how I view the Guardians in this discussion.
Ashley, what stood out to you from what you heard?
Yeah, for me, kind of going off of what Doug said, it was Hoynesy picking the Cavs and then Chris Fedor picking the Guardians. And I think what's so interesting about, when we compare them to the Browns, like those postseasons are obviously very different, right? And I think both of those teams, like the Guardians, have some roster questions, right? And how they're built questions. And the Cavs, I think the biggest takeaway from Fedor was, given the landscape of the NBA, given how young they are, even with Donovan Mitchell, that they're probably still a few years away from being true contenders. And then Mary Kay going with Stefanski. I just think the NFL postseason is so different in terms of there aren't 7-game series that you have to be worried about. So I do think it was kind of interesting to hear Hoynesy and Fedor pick each other's teams and not their own.
The postseason format is interesting. And, look, we could go a million ways in this discussion, but it is sort of like, in the NBA, the best team usually wins, or one of the 2 or 3 best teams usually wins. In the NFL, it's really random, or it can be. And in baseball, sometimes it's like who gets the hottest. So that's why this is so complicated when you kind of think about it really big picture here. For me, I guess I don't want to say my big one yet because that comes down to the bigger discussion. But I did think it was interesting to hear Chris talk about JB-Bickerstaff and the way he manages that locker room. It sort of sounded like the way Hoynesy and a lot of people talk about Terry-Francona too, that he understands how to kind of get his team through that grind of just the day-to-day long season. You're around each other every day. Guys get on each other's nerves. We see it a lot in the NBA, especially. Like, guys just get sick of each other and want to get away from each other. And that's really important. I do wonder, though, does that always translate to being able to go win a 7-game series? And I think we've sometimes seen that a little bit here and there with Tito, and we haven't gotten to see JB really get tested like that yet. So I thought that was interesting. Okay, so let's have it. I was thinking maybe we should eliminate one. Maybe we should just go through the process of getting this down to 2.
What? Oh, sorry.
Well, okay. So I'm going to say.
Whoops. Sorry, I didn't mean to say that again. It's Kevin. Sorry, it just comes out.
This is why I might agree with you on this one, Doug. When I was listening to Mary Kay talk about Kevin Stefanski, and we recorded our daily podcast right after we recorded that interview. And I said on that podcast, Ashley, you probably remember this, I'm not going to make the Baker Mayfield comparison.
Yeah.
I am going to do it here. When I was listening...
Yes, Dan's been sleeping on this for the last 12 hours. He went to bed, the thoughts formulated overnight. He woke up this morning and was like, I'm ready to do this. Let's go.
When I listened to Mary Kay talk about Kevin Stefanski, and I don't think this was her intention, but this was my takeaway. Man, it really felt like Kevin Stefanski was doing a lot of I'm going to hire this guy and this guy and this guy because they can do stuff that I can't do. And it just, the more and more this goes on, there's so many similarities to the whole Baker Mayfield saga. how it was, this guy's the best quarterback they've had since 99. He should have won Rookie of the Year, but he wasn't good enough. And the arguments for Kevin right now are, well, he was Coach of the Year in 2020, and they made the playoffs, and he's probably the best coach they've had since they came back. But we kind of have to sit here and do a whole bunch of things to hold this guy up and prop him up and fill in some of the blanks. And I came away from that, even though Mary Kay picked Kevin, and I don't know, maybe other people listened to that interview and thought the same thing as she did. I came away from that feeling a little worse. Like if I was thinking about picking Kevin for the answer to this discussion, I felt worse about doing that. And I wasn't going to do that anyway, but it didn't convince me. So Doug, I think I might be in the same boat as you on this one. So Ashley, is there like, do you disagree? Is Kevin the obvious one to eliminate here? Where do we go with this?
I was going to also go with Kevin, because I can't. Like as we heard all of these interviews, and I mean, in my own thinking of like covering the Cavs, right, and filling in for Hoynesy sometimes on the Guardians, and just like paying attention to what that team is doing. For me, like, I need them to prove it at this point, because like the Guardians and the Cavs to me have essentially proved in some ways with these coaches where these rosters are now that they just feel further along than the Browns do to me. And I think like the one thing Kevin would have going for him if you were to make an argument for not eliminating him is kind of what we talked about with the postseason formats for these different sports, that the NFL can be a bit more random. Some years it's not that random, right? But some years it's pretty random. But I think right now, from everything we know, until we see if this team has made tangible improvements, I think it's really hard to say, yeah, they're for sure going to be able to beat the Chiefs or beat the Bills, like these top teams, the Bengals, these top teams in a postseason. We just haven't seen that. So I think for me, he was kind of like the obvious of the three here, unfortunately.
Okay, so I guess we gotta make picks here. We gotta plant our flags. And I'll say this, even though Kevin has been eliminated, this is like, so in the early off season of the NFL, I watch a lot of Shark Tank because it's on like CNBC late at night, and I love Shark Tank, so I'll like flip through. Oh my god, it's like the one like actual TV show I'll watch that's not just streaming. So the reason I bring that up is like sometimes you're watching Shark Tank and like four people say they're out and somebody makes an offer and another, one of the guys who was out is like, oh, I'm back in. I want to make my offer. That's my long way of saying, like, if you've been sitting here thinking, maybe I want to make a case for Kevin, you can bring him back in. I'm not going to do that. Okay.
Oh,
sorry, Doug. That was directed at you.
Yeah, I'm not.
All right. I guess, do we need a consensus here? Let's each kind of make our choice, and let's see if there's any sort of consensus here as to
We're
who it's going to
representing
be.
a city.
Yeah,
a city.
I think we need
hundreds of thousands of loyal, diehard fans of these three organizations. Yes, we need a consensus.
Okay. And is none an option? Like, is that?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I just want to make sure. I will go first here, and I really, really want to pick Tito, but I just don't trust the Guardians. And one of my reasonings is, and I kind of mentioned this a little bit when we were talking to Hoynesy, like Jose Ramirez, right, is a superstar. You win World Series with players like Jose Ramirez. He is an MVP candidate. But Jose Ramirez hurt his thumb like middle of the year last year when they were in LA. And he was never quite the same player. And the bottom line is the Guardians just don't have the depth. So the Yankees could have a star player get hurt and play hurt. And they've got two or three guys behind that guy that can still keep that lineup moving. And the Guardians just don't have that. And so I think that's hard over the course of from February to November. Everybody's got to be healthy. Everybody's got to produce. And you just have no room for error. And they went all in 2016, as all in as they're going to go, trading for Andrew Miller, giving up their top two prospects. And they came this close. And I don't know if that's going to happen again because I think they're so invested in all of these prospects that they have. So I just can't pick Tito. Even though I think he's the best guy, and even though I think if he were someplace that spent even just a little bit more money, I think he'd probably win one or two more. I don't think I can pick him. I will go with JB. And maybe that's part of it is because, look, I'm not around the Cavs as much as Chris, as much as Ashley. I do follow a lot of NBA. I don't know if the Cavs can go toe-to-toe in a 7-game series with a Giannis or a Tatum or whoever else. But I do think bringing in Donovan Mitchell gives you that guy who, on a given night, can go toe-to-toe with those guys. So I'm gonna pick somebody, even though I'm a little worried JB could be the guy before the guy. I'm gonna pick him. I'm gonna say it's JB-Bickerstaff. Not this year, but next year. So there's my pick. Ashley, who do you think?
I was also going to go with JB for very similar reasons in terms of, for as great as the Guardians run was last year, and I think it's great that they have young guys. I think a lot about Terry Francona did an interview like towards the end of the season, and somebody asked him, how are you able to get all these guys to buy in and have this much success? And he essentially said, like, they're young kids who don't know any better, so they're willing to listen and like kind of move on and put things behind them. I do think there's some truth to that, but I think in my mind, I can't get 2016 out of my head either, and how close they came. And for as good as I think Tito is, I don't know if they're going to get over the hump. I do think that hearing Chris say he thinks they're about 2 years away from being true contenders, I think that might ultimately push JB over the top. And I hear the argument about him being the guy before the guy potentially, and are we worried they would move on from him? I am not quite there yet. For some of the concerns I have about JB, that others have about JB, that I think are valid. I think, and we talked about this with Chris, Dan, when they hired him, they brought him in as essentially a long-term solution, right? Like, they looked at John Beilein and they needed a very specific thing at that time that they thought John Beilein could provide for them. It ended up being a disaster. He didn't even last a season, and they came right to JB. But I think for so long, JB was their answer. And that doesn't mean that it's going to change, or that it's not going to change, I should say. But I do think that they are closer than we think. And the biggest thing for me that they need is not necessarily something that JB did. I thought Chris made great points about some of the counters he made during the playing games last year, even though those ended up being losses. But I do think the NBA is all about matchups and experience. And I think you need the right combination of those. But I think the Cavs are just in the strongest spot, and I think JB is the right guy for this team right now.
Doug, what's your pick?
So I will say the argument that the Guardians are the least blocked, which Hoynesy kind of made. And if you look at like the preseason projections right now, Pacoda and some other things, it's like it's probably a toss-up between the Guardians and Minnesota in the Central. And so they have a path to get in a sport that we all kind of agree is the most random in the postseason. So get in and then let Shane Bieber and Tristan McKenzie and your bullpen put it away and hope Jose Ramirez drives in at least one run every game. And you can see it, right? Get back in a weak division and then rely on starting pitching and your bullpen. I think that's reasonable. I think that is a reasonable argument, that if the question is, will the Guardians ever be the best team in baseball? No. Could they win the World Series? Yeah, they could. Yeah, no, they could win the World Series as like the 5th best team in baseball that got hot, Dan, which you said at the very beginning of this. So that's a very reasonable argument. But I'm also going to pick JB-Bickerstaff because I can't get there all the way with the Guardians. And it's possible a year from now, you're saying, what do you do with Giannis? What do you do with the Celtics and Tatum? And maybe Evan Mobley's going to be at a place in the year where, like, what do you mean? What are you going to do? You're going to have Evan Mobley lock those guys down and it's good to go. And Garland and Mitchell are going to go off and that's it. And then they added a wing and they're good to go. What's the question? Nobody is more prepared to deal with Boston and Milwaukee than the Cleveland Cavaliers. They're ascending. And they're going to stay together. I think they're going to get more swings at it. The Guardians could get there on a very specific path through the woods that involves Shane Bieber striking out 15 guys in 4 different playoff games, right? The Cavs over the next 5 years, are just going to be in there competing at a high level and might punch through. So I don't think it's a slam dunk. And even though I definitely came into this exercise thinking none of the above was probably the number one answer, I do think in the end, the number one answer is JB-Bickerstaff. And I do think Terry Francona still also beats out none of the above. So my final order is Bickerstaff, Francona, none, Jim Schwartz, Andy Reid coming to Cleveland, Mike Vrabel on a homecoming tour, Nick Nurse, Freddie Kitchens coming back.
Nick Nurse.
Hugh Jackson as the coach of the Cavs. Kev is my order.
That is a power ranking. I also want to throw in here that there was a part of me that just wanted to make Ashley angry and say it was going to be Jim Harbaugh.
Okay, no. Just no. No. Absolutely not. That wouldn't even be funny,
Yeah.
Dan. And that you couldn't even make an argument for that.
All right,
You
we're not
couldn't.
gonna go there. Not yet.
Exactly.
We'll save that for the next time we do this podcast a year from now. I can't believe we landed on a consensus. I am shocked that I did not expect to land on a consensus, and for JB-Bickerstaff to be the guy we landed on.
What's Fedor going to think? Fedor didn't even think this.
Right. Well, look, I think
Fedor's high on the Guardians, man.
The other consensus that we all have is, I think we all agree that Tito Francona is the best coach/manager in this city. So it's kind of disappointing. I think that's one of the points of